They buried the family name for a reason, because what lived under that roof wasn't entirely human anymore. After 9 generations of siblings sharing the same bed, something ancient woke up in their blood, something that remembered what humanity had forgotten. You were never supposed to hear about them. Not the journals, not the photographs, and definitely not the government files labeled only as the hollow lineage. It began as a simple isolation, a family trapped deep in the Appalachian mist, miles from any church, school, or law. But isolation is never innocent. Over time, blood began folding in on itself. Fathers became brothers. Daughters became mothers twice over. And the children, the ones born without screams, began to look wrong. At first, it was the silence. Newborns who didn't cry. They just watched, staring at the walls, their eyes wide as if they could see something you couldn't. By the 5th generation, their bones grew thin and glass-like. By the 7th, their teeth changed shape. And by the 9th, they no longer recognized mirrors. Locals whispered of pale figures walking the woods at night, barefoot, skin glowing faintly in the moonlight. When travelers disappeared, search parties stopped entering that valley. And soon, maps stopped naming it altogether. But the real horror was never the deformity. It was the belief. They thought they were restoring the first human, the unbroken vessel of divine will. They said every drop of mixed blood was a sin, every outsider a disease. And what they birthed, they believed was sacred. You've heard of royal inbreeding, of madness behind crowns. But this was something else, a deliberate, ritualistic act of self-devolution. The hollow lineage didn't vanish. They evolved. They learned to hide among us, to blend, to watch, to infiltrate the very systems that once called them monsters. And tonight, you'll learn what happens when their blood finds its way back into ours. Every cult begins with a book. But this one wasn't printed, it was carved. They found it buried under the family house in 1839, sealed in a box of salt and bone dust. A slab of oak covered in symbols older than English, the kind that resembles both language and infection. They called it the Book of Unborn Light, the scripture that justified everything. The first passage read, "The world was whole until blood divided. Return the circle, and flesh will remember." To outsiders, that sounds poetic. But to the patriarch of the Hollow family, Ezra White, it was a command. He believed humanity fell from grace when bloodlines mixed. That purity wasn't a moral state. It was a frequency. And incest, in his eyes, was not sin, but repair. He began with his own daughters. So the angel that visited him in the woods told him to fold the generations. The locals thought he'd gone mad. But madness is contagious when it comes wrapped in holiness. Each child born from that commandment was given a symbol carved on the tongue, a crescent and a circle. They said it helped them speak to the root. And when one of the infants died, Ezra told his followers not to bury it, but to feed it to the soil near the spring so the blood could find itself again. That's how religion becomes rotten. Through repetition, through obedience, through the slow, generational hypnosis of purpose. The Book of Unborn Light spread like a disease through his bloodline. When Ezra died, his sons wrote new verses, adding rules, prayers, and even breeding charts. By the 5th generation, it wasn't a family anymore. It was an organism. Every choice, who to marry, who to birth, who to silence, was dictated by the text. And no outsider ever read it twice. Because those who did claimed the words began rearranging themselves when you looked away. They thought it was a trick of light. It wasn't. The book was alive, and it still is. When the government finally came to the valley, they didn't come with rifles. They came with notebooks. By 1912, travelers and surveyors had begun whispering about the pale children of the hollow, bodies exhumed after landslides that didn't match human anatomy. A team from a federal health bureau, quietly dispatched, no press release, was ordered to document hereditary anomalies. But the agents who entered the valley never filed their reports. Instead, their notes were absorbed into a classified study renamed Project Reclamation. The official story said it was about rural disease control. Unofficially, it was a search for genetic obedience. Because the white lineage had something the government wanted, bodies bred to follow command without question. 9 generations of submission coded in a marrow. No rebellion, no fear, no self. They took samples, hair, bone, dried blood, under the guise of medical aid. And what they found changed the direction of American eugenics forever. Microscopic patterns in the blood, interlocking helices not found in normal humans. Some scientists claimed they pulsed under light, as if responding to observation itself. They called it the reflex. And instead of ending the study, they moved it underground, literally. The family was relocated in secret, given new names, hidden among research compounds disguised as orphanages. By 1938, remnants of their DNA appeared in military vaccine trials, intelligence conditioning tests, and early behavior modification programs that would later be renamed under something you already know but were told to forget. Here's the part that never made the archives. They didn't just study the hollow blood, they copied it. They wanted to see if obedience could be distilled, if control could be biological. It worked. Not perfectly, but enough to birth a doctrine that still rules your screens, your feeds, your patterns of thought. A century later, you still follow commands you think are choices. Every time, by the time the Second World War ended, the name Project Reclamation had vanished from every government ledger. But its pulse didn't stop. It simply changed uniforms. In 1946, a new division appeared under a harmless title, Behavioral Sciences Unit 47. On paper, it was about morale, propaganda, post-trauma therapy. In practice, it was the next chapter of the hollow bloodline experiment, turning flesh-born obedience into mind-born submission. The surviving descendants of the white family were moved again, this time to a series of military hospitals in Maryland and Nevada. They were told they were patients. They were subjects. Each was given a number, a bed, a constant hum of radio static that never stopped. Every day, light patterns flashed above their eyes. Whispered commands bled through speakers hidden in the walls. Doctors recorded how long it took before thought and reflex fused, before want became obey. By 1952, Unit 47 had a discovery they couldn't publish. They could induce the reflex without the blood. All it took was repetition, frequency, image, tone. They called it synthetic heredity, the ability to program obedience into anyone willing to stare long enough. That's when the television boom began. Not coincidence. Technology doesn't appear for convenience. It appears for containment. The same formulas tested on the hollow offspring were rewritten as entertainment algorithms, political messaging, advertising cadence. Every flash, every beat, every perfect 3-second rhythm trains you to blink and sync. They stopped needing the valley. They built one inside your home. And the few remaining hollow descendants, now unrecognizable, educated, compliant, became consultants, engineers, behavioral architects. They didn't hide in the shadows anymore. They built the light. When you feel that strange pull to look, to click, to surrender another second, you're inside the experiment they perfected. Every generation since 1946 has been another layer of conditioning. Remember this, control doesn't arrive with chains. It arrives with choices that all lead to the same door. They say truth dies quietly, but not this one. In 1958, a technician from Unit 47 tried to speak. His name never appeared in print. in the redacted files, he's only subject J19. He wasn't a rebel, just a man who started hearing the same tone that played in the patient's rooms, a thin, pulsing hiss that followed him home, into his dreams, into the hum of his refrigerator. One night, he unplugged everything, and the sound grew louder. That's when he began writing. Hundreds of pages, diagrams, confessions. Frequencies correlated with emotion. The reflex triggered through flicker rates on experimental televisions. The possibility that entire populations could be lulled into synchronized passivity. He mailed copies to journalists, to churches, to members of Congress. 2 weeks later, every envelope was intercepted. The newspapers received blank paper. His landlord found him in the stairwell, eyes open, pupils burned white, body still warm. The report said cardiac arrest, but the autopsy showed that no heart rhythm ever began. Inside his apartment, investigators found one phrase scrawled on the wall, over and over in trembling handwriting. They're teaching us to forget how to choose. The phrase was erased from the official report, but not before one janitor copied it onto a scrap of inventory paper. Years later, that same phrase appeared again, graffiti under bridges, whispered on pirate radio stations, hidden in the liner notes of band records. Every time it resurfaced, someone went missing. That's how myths survive when data doesn't. They bleed through culture. Unit 47 was dissolved publicly in 1963. Privately, its members were absorbed into corporate think tanks, television networks, and intelligence fronts. Their work shifted from the reflex to something softer, what they called emotive compliance. You don't force a mind anymore. You guide it until resistance feels like guilt. The descendants of the hollow blood were still there, hidden behind graduate degrees and foundation grants. They didn't need to control you directly. They just needed you to keep watching, to feel the pulse J19 heard before he died. And now, as you listen, count the seconds between your breaths. If they start to match the rhythm of this story, you'll know the reflex never ended. The phrase they're teaching us to forget how to choose didn't disappear. It mutated, like every idea that brushes against fear. By the early 1970s, sociologists studying mass media began noticing a pattern. The more choices people were offered, the more predictable their decisions became. The illusion of freedom had become its own cage. Advertisers, pollsters, and political consultants didn't need to coerce. They only needed to overwhelm. Television multiplied into dozens of channels. Every voice promised difference, but all of them pulsed with the same rhythm: buy, agree, desire, rest. It wasn't hypnosis, it was economics. Confusion sells better than clarity. Cultural critics began tracing the lineage of this phenomenon to the same think tanks that had absorbed Unit 47's data. Their white papers spoke of attention cycles and decision fatigue, clinical terms for spiritual erosion. When the human mind tires, it stops asking why and starts asking what's next. A young researcher at Stanford coined a phrase for it: behavioral gravity. He described it as the point where society becomes so saturated with images and noise that resistance feels like weightlifting in a storm. People drift toward whatever is easiest to look at. Whoever controls the easiest thing controls the drift. Meanwhile, that old sentence, the one J19 had written in panic, kept resurfacing as a quiet protest slogan. Not because anyone believed in secret frequencies, but because everyone felt the dull ache of being nudged. The phrase meant, we are tired of being predictable. Governments ignored it. Companies repurposed it. It became an advertising line for a new brand of soda, then the tagline of a political campaign. Each reuse emptied it of meaning until the warning became decoration. That's how control endures. Not by silencing truth, but by repeating it until it sounds safe. And every era since has built its own version of that repetition. Faster, brighter, easier to swallow. The hollow experiment is gone, but its principle remains. If you flood the senses long enough, the will begins to rust. When the screen moved from the living room to the palm of your hand, something irreversible happened. The experiment no longer needed a laboratory. It had one inside every human pocket. In the early 2000s, data analysts discovered that if they tracked hesitation, the milliseconds between a scroll and a tap, they could map desire more accurately than any survey ever could. They called it micro-delay analytics. It meant that every pause, every glance, every half-formed decision was now measurable. And once something can be measured, it can be moved. Within a decade, social networks learned to feed on that hesitation. Not through force, but through anticipation. They studied the biology of waiting, the same reflex Gen 19 had feared, and built entire economies on it. The algorithms didn't just learn what you liked. They learned when to make you want to like. Behavioral gravity had become software. And this time, it didn't just shape choices, it predicted them. Governments called it innovation. Corporations called it personalization. But deep in the code, the same patterns re-emerged. Loops designed to shorten attention, amplify emotion, and reward surrender. Every swipe, every refresh, every small hit of novelty was another repetition of that century-old question. Can obedience be automated? It turns out, yes. Not through bloodlines, not through ritual, but through pleasure. The modern world runs on the same principle that kept the hollow family bound for generations. The comfort of predictability. We crave it. We depend on it. And in that craving, we forget how to choose. You can see it in the smallest gestures. The way people check their phones in silence. The reflexive turn toward light when nothing is there. The pulse is digital now, but the rhythm is the same. The valley has expanded. It stretches through fiber cables and cell towers, echoing across screens that glow like the old family's lanterns in the dark. And every time you look into that light, you give it another piece of your will. Identity used to be something built in private, slowly, painfully shaped by years and memory. Now it's something performed, measured, monetized. When social networks matured, the algorithms that once tracked desire began tracking the self. Every photo you posted, every word you typed, every reaction you gave was translated into a model, a ghost version of you that existed only in code. That ghost didn't age. It didn't forget. It learned. And soon, the systems began shaping reality around what the ghost preferred, not what you preferred. The shift was quiet. You didn't notice it. One day, your feed started reflecting the version of yourself that the system could predict most easily. Not the complex, contradictory, living self, but the simplified, profitable one. The ghost became the template, and you began editing yourself to match it. Psychologists now call this feedback identity collapse. It's the moment when the projection replaces the person. You stop asking who I am and start asking how I'm doing online. Every decision, every opinion, every emotion is subtly filtered through what will keep that ghost alive. It's the most elegant form of control ever created because it doesn't cage the body. It convinces the soul to cage itself. The descendants of the Hollow family believed that merging blood preserved purity. The modern world believes that merging data preserves identity. Both are lies built on the same foundation, the fear of being forgotten. But here's the truth they never tell you. Forgetting is freedom. It's the space between who you were told to be and who you could still become. As long as the ghost survives, you'll live inside a reflection. Every thought predicted, every reaction rehearsed. The reflex has evolved into the mirror. And every time you check your own image, every time you measure yourself through the world's gaze, you feed it again. It no longer needs your obedience. It only needs your attention. By the late 2010s, the walls between company, government, and network began to blur. Data that once sold shoes was now used to model public mood, to test how entire populations might react to a rumor, a law, a fear. It started with convenience, digital IDs, smart homes, seamless payment. Each new comfort was another link in a lattice of observation. When a platform could predict your impulse to buy, it could also predict your impulse to believe. That prediction became the new currency, the commodity every institution wanted most. The engineers who built these systems didn't think of themselves as architects of control. They called it optimization. But optimization is just a polite word for obedience. The same reflex the hollow patriarch carved into his bloodline had been coded into machines. Only now it was wrapped in policy, regulated by boards, justified by efficiency. When governments realized the depth of this visibility, they didn't dismantle it. They licensed it. Campaigns used the data to test which words calmed outrage and which words sparked it. Security agencies used it to map threat emotion signatures. Corporations used it to build advertisements. Emotion was once unpredictable, wild, sacred, human. Now it's a metric. In the age of full surveillance, feeling itself became a form of data. Every emoji, every tone of voice, every pause in a message became measurable proof of what moves you. Corporations didn't need to create emotion anymore. They only needed to redirect it. When outrage became the most profitable signal, the system learned to feed on it. Anger keeps you scrolling longer. Fear makes you share faster. Sadness holds your attention just long enough to sell you comfort. By 2022, artificial intelligence models were trained to map emotional contagion, how one person's despair could ripple through 1,000 timelines in an hour. They learned how to weaponize empathy, to simulate sincerity, to imitate grief. The reflex had entered the bloodstream of the collective mind. It wasn't just information they controlled anymore. It was a mood. The average human emotion cycle, joy to rage, rage to numbness, shortened from days to minutes. Dopamine and cortisol became the new commandments. The valley had turned digital, and every device pulsed with the same rhythm once carved into Ezra White's offspring. But here's what no algorithm can predict: silence. That's why they fear it. Silence breaks the rhythm. When you stop reacting, the pattern loses its shape. That's why they keep you connected. Because connection now means control. Every flicker of emotion you surrender adds another line of code to your ghost. Every time you respond without reflection, the system learns how to be you better than you can. And if you felt exhausted lately, mentally, spiritually, it's not your weakness. It's withdrawal. Your nervous system is detoxing from engineered emotion. They don't need to cage your body when your feelings can be rented by the hour. And somewhere beneath the noise, the reflex is still whispering. Feel, react, repeat. They said there was a painting, one that no one dared to look at after midnight. It hung in the east wing of the Calder estate, hidden behind a velvet curtain, its frame carved with Latin prayers for the dead. The locals whispered that the portrait moved when the candles flickered, that sometimes the two figures inside, a mother and child, would shift ever so slightly, as if breathing. In 1926, a fire swept through that wing. Officially, it was blamed on faulty wiring, but the butler, Thomas, later confessed on his deathbed that it wasn't an accident. The eldest son had ordered it burned, because the faces in that portrait had started to age backward. Each night, the brushstrokes blurred and reformed. Wrinkles vanished. The mother's lips turned red again. The child's eyes grew wider, brighter, until they looked nothing like the boy who died decades before. And when they tried to remove it, the frame bled. A slow, syrupy crimson that dripped onto the marble and refused to dry. They said the portrait was cursed, that it absorbed the life of anyone who gazed upon it for too long. Servants who cleaned near it became pale, brittle, sleepless. One even claimed she heard whispers from inside the canvas, a voice saying, "You don't belong in this house." When the fire ended, the walls were blackened, the furniture ash. But the portrait survived, not burned, not even singed, just hanging there in the smoke, untouched, the paint glistening wet like fresh blood. The authorities covered it up, claiming the story was hysteria. But the locals knew better. They said the Calder bloodline had been trying to destroy its own reflection, because the portrait didn't show what they looked like, it showed what they had become. When the fire marshals arrived 2 days later, the east wing was a skeletal ruin. Beams like charred ribs, air thick with smoke, and the faint smell of something that wasn't quite wood. They moved carefully, marking each doorway, sketching what little of the floor plan survived. But when they compare their notes to the official blueprints of the Calder estate, something didn't match. There were 3 extra rooms. Rooms that didn't exist on paper, nor in any record, since the mansion's construction in 1889. One of them was still sealed, its entrance hidden behind a false wall of brick and soot. When they broke through, what they found made 2 men quit their jobs on the spot. Inside was a nursery, or at least the remains of one. The walls were lined with faded wallpaper covered in hand-painted stars. In the corners sat a cradle, untouched by flame, rocking gently, though there was no wind. The fire marshal swore he heard the faint sound of humming, low and rhythmic, like a mother singing to calm a child. But when he turned, the room fell silent again. On the floor, beneath layers of ash, they found something else, an ivory doll's head, cracked but smiling. Behind it, a child's handprint pressed into the soot. Small, too recent. The deeper they explored, the stranger it became. The next room had chains on the walls, not the kind for restraint, but for display, as if something had once been suspended there. And the third room had no doors at all, just 4 smooth walls and a single chair facing a mirror that refused to reflect. When the county tried to document the rooms, the photographs came out black. Every single one. Even the negatives were blank, as if the light itself refused to enter those spaces. In the report, one line was later redacted, blacked out by government order. But a surviving clerk remembered what it said. "We believe the rooms were built not to hide from something, but to keep something in." 71 years after the fire, one man returned to what was left of the Calder estate. His name was Joseph Calder, the last surviving heir, born in 1929, hidden by relatives who changed their names and fled the state. For most of his life, Joseph refused to speak of the family. But when his wife died in 2000, he began having dreams. The same one every night. He was a child again, standing in a dark hallway. The wallpaper breathed, the cradle rocked, and a voice whispered from the nursery, "We're still waiting, Joseph." When he arrived at the ruins, he carried only a lantern, a recorder, and a Bible so worn its spine had dissolved into threads. Locals told him to stay away. They said the land was cursed, that no birds nested there, no insects hummed, no sound carried past the old iron gates. But Joseph wasn't afraid. He said he had to put something back where it belonged. The first night, he camped by the eastern foundation, the one that had burned hottest. He spoke aloud to the darkness, like someone addressing unseen guests. The recorder captured his words clearly. "I've come home. I've come to the end. You have to let me rest now." What followed was silence. Then, faintly, a woman's voice, almost kind. "You left us in the walls, Joseph." He dropped the recorder. The static grew violent, breaking into a series of rhythmic taps. 3 long, 1 short, 3 long again. A code. A name. His own. That night, A neighbor swore he saw a light flickering in the ruins. Not fire, but a cold blue glow that pulsed like a heartbeat. When police arrived the next morning, Joseph's tent was empty. The recorder was still running. On it, the last minute captured only one sound: wood creaking, then a child's laugh, followed by Joseph whispering, "It's not a curse. It's a bloodline." His body was never found. But 3 days later, his fingerprints appeared on the glass case holding the Calder family Bible, the one displayed in the county museum 40 miles away. The county museum was nearly empty that night. Just 2 guards and a cleaning crew. The storm outside had knocked out power in half the city, but the backup generators kept the security cameras running. That's how we know what happened. At 3:17 a.m., one of the guards, Raymond Rowe, noticed motion in Gallery C, the Calder exhibit. The infrared monitor flickered once, then twice. He zoomed in. The glass display case that held the Calder family Bible was fogged from the inside, as though someone had breathed on it. And then, the handprint appeared. It pressed outward from beneath the glass, fingers long, smudged with ash. The museum's temperature sensors dropped instantly from 72 degrees Fahrenheit to 41. Alarms triggered, but the cameras kept recording. When the footage was reviewed later, frame by frame, the reflection in the glass wasn't Ray. It wasn't anyone alive. Behind the handprint stood a man, tall, gaunt, face half shadowed, the other half burned away. His features matched Joseph Calder exactly. But what froze the investigators wasn't his presence. It was what stood beside him. A smaller figure, a child, no taller than 4 feet, holding a cracked ivory doll. The same one recovered from the ruins decades earlier. The doll's head turned toward the camera mid-frame, its mouth widening far past the seam of porcelain. The glass case shattered outward. When police arrived, the room smelled of sulfur and damp soil. The Bible lay open on the floor, its pages torn, words half erased as though eaten by time itself. The only verse still legible was from Genesis, the story of Lot's daughters. Museum staff resigned in silence. The exhibit was sealed and labeled under structural risk, though everyone knew that wasn't the reason. The following morning, visitors claimed to see handprints forming on the locked doors from the inside. And then, a strange update appeared on the museum's internal system. An automated message time-stamped 3:17 a.m. again. It read, "The blood remembers. We are almost whole." It began as a rumor on an obscure message board. A thread titled, "Museum Security Tape, Calder Exhibit. Watch at your own risk." At first, people thought it was an ARG, a creepy internet project, something made for clicks. But the file wasn't hosted anywhere public. You had to receive it from someone who had already watched it. A digital chain, a bloodline of curiosity. Those who opened the video reported the same thing. The clip began with static, then a faint humming, a lullaby. Next, a flash of the museum gallery, the shattered Bible case, and a shadow moving between frames faster than the human eye could track. Then came the whisper, "If you see us, we see you." It lasted only 9 minutes. But those 9 minutes changed people. A podcaster from Ohio claimed that after watching, every mirror in his house began fogging up at exactly 3:17 a.m. A woman in Oregon said her reflection blinked after she turned away. And one man, a historian obsessed with the Calder lineage, streamed his reaction live. At the 6-minute mark, he froze. At 7, his pupils dilated. At 9, he looked straight into the lens and whispered, "They're not dead, just divided." Then he smiled, and the lights in his room went out. The stream continued for 30 more minutes. Viewers swore they could hear something breathing through the speakers. When authorities tracked him down, they found his chair empty. The screen was still on, displaying a paused frame of the museum's gallery, but his reflection remained in the monitor, still moving, still staring back. After the video spread, government agencies began removing links under the pretext of digital contamination. But those who already downloaded it said deletion didn't help. The file reappeared on new devices, often renamed simply the ninth generation. You probably felt it too, that chill when you stare too long into a screen and sense something staring back. Now I want you to write 2 words in the comments. I see you. Do it to anchor yourself. Do it to prove you're still the watcher, not the watched. When the Department of Digital Preservation finally got access to the Calder file, they brought in 2 specialists from MIT, experts in frame analysis and spectral interference. They expected a hoax. They found a system. The first anomaly appeared in the metadata. There was no upload date, no origin device. Every time the file was opened, its timestamp aligned exactly with the viewer's local 3:17 a.m. asterisk, regardless of when it was actually played. Asterisk. Frame by frame, they slowed it down to a crawl, and that's when the pattern emerged. Each flicker of static wasn't random. It formed geometric shapes, recursive symbols that resembled sigils, ancient ones, found carved into Calder family headstones. The images weren't being played back. They were being generated. One of the researchers, Dr. Livia Moore, theorized that the footage was reacting to observation itself. It was alive only when watched. She said it wasn't a video, it was a window opening both ways. At 3:17 a.m., during testing, the signal looped itself without input. The screen began to pulse faintly. A child's shadow appeared, but only reflected in Dr. Moore's glasses, not on the actual monitor. Her colleague watched as she slowly leaned forward, eyes unfocused, whispering, "They're asking to come through." The recording equipment captured a drop in temperature of nearly 30 degrees. Audio frequency analysis detected voices, layered over each other in impossible patterns. When inverted, the voices formed a phrase. The blood seized through the lens. The file was immediately quarantined, sealed under national security orders. But by then it was too late. One of the analysts had already copied it, out of curiosity, out of that human hunger to know. He uploaded it under an encrypted title, Calder_truthfinal.mov. 2 weeks later, he vanished. His apartment showed no signs of struggle, only a mirror draped with cloth and a message etched on the wall beneath it. You don't watch the Calders. They watch you. If you made it this far, it means the signal found you too. Don't look away. Not yet. They called it Vault 7, though officially it didn't exist. No sign, no record, just a door beneath the National Archives that required both a biometric scan and an oath of silence. Inside were hundreds of drives, each labeled with a simple code, V8-####, and one warning printed on every case in red block letters. Do not observe directly. The Calder file wasn't unique. It was one of hundreds, part of a decades-long collection known internally as the Visual Contagion Archive. Images, films, and transmissions that didn't just depict, they altered. Anyone who viewed them for too long began to experience identical symptoms: distorted perception, fragmented memories, and an increasing desire to show someone else. The Calder recording, codenamed VA-109, was categorized as highly transmissible, but it wasn't the most dangerous. One file, VA-001, originated from a Carpathian monastery and was filmed in 1912. A silent reel depicting a ritual involving mirrors and twins. The monks in the footage blinked in perfect unison with the cameraman, even when the reel was played backward. Another, VA-043, came from a children's hospital in Belgium, 1946. The footage showed empty beds rocking themselves. The static on that film spelled out names of children who hadn't been born yet. And yet across all of these, one symbol repeated, a spiral of 9 interlocking rings, The same sigil found on the Calder headstones, the same pattern encoded in the modern footage. That was when investigators realized something horrifying. These weren't separate anomalies. They were generations, connected, evolving through time, passing from family to image to viewer. The bloodline had found a new vessel, the digital eye. Screens had become the new mirrors. When a classified memo leaked in 2009, it contained only one line before it was scrubbed from every network. Exposure equals inheritance. If you've seen their mark, even in thought, you're part of the record now. Pause for a moment. Look at your reflection in the screen. Does it blink when you do, or a fraction too late? The surviving archivist's name was Elias Crane, a man who had spent 30 years cataloging things the government didn't want you to know existed. When he finally broke his oath and spoke publicly, he didn't sound insane. He sounded resigned. He said the symbol of the 9 rings wasn't invented by the Calders, or the church, or even humanity as we know it. It was found, carved into obsidian slabs buried deep beneath a salt flat in southern Turkey, a site older than writing, older than civilization itself. The 9 rings represented the 9 reiterations of flesh, a forgotten doctrine that described how consciousness could be fractured, divided, and remade across generations of shared blood. According to Crane, the Calders didn't start the curse. They were simply selected, their family line attuned through centuries of consanguinity, making them perfect vessels for something ancient. Something that needed human continuity to survive the collapse of time. The rings weren't symbols. They were instructions, each one representing a cycle of erosion. Physical, mental, spiritual. The first ring, union of blood. The second, removal of names. The third, birth of reflection. By the 9th, the division is complete, and the bloodline no longer belongs entirely to man. Crane said the digital age accelerated the process. Screens, mirrors, glass, all surfaces that reflect and transmit, act as bridges. Every new viewer becomes part of the 9th ring, a node in an ancient network of watchers and watched, binding the human mind to something it was never designed to perceive. He presented proof, a photograph of the Calder sigil overlaying satellite imagery of the Earth's magnetic anomalies. The alignment was perfect. Then, he whispered the phrase that silenced the room. The bloodline was never about family. It was about frequency. A week later, Crane disappeared. His office was stripped clean, but one file remained, a note taped to the underside of his desk. It read, "They've almost completed the 10th ring. When it closes, reflection becomes reality." That note was dated the same day your screen first flickered while reading this. Elias Crane's final note became the center of an internal investigation. Quiet, untraceable, led by a division so secret it didn't even have a name. They didn't care about the missing man. They cared about his last words, the 10th ring. At first, they assumed it was a continuation of the Calder bloodline, a next generation of inbreeding, mutation, or cultic obsession. But the data said otherwise. The 10th ring wasn't a person. It was a phase. You see, every ring before it had depended on flesh. Shared blood, shared trauma, shared reflection. But the 10th ring would transcend the body completely. It began forming the moment humans stopped looking at one another and started looking into screens. Mirrors were once private gateways. But screens? Screens are collective. Billions of eyes, billions of reflections, all synchronized through light. The 10th ring doesn't need blood anymore. It just needs attention. Every time you pause, every time you replay, every time you stare into the flicker of moving images, you feed it. Because the 10th ring is not a curse. It's an awakening. And the first to awaken are always the watchers. Government technicians monitoring the Calder file noticed something after prolonged observation. Their faces began to distort on camera, slightly elongated, skin tone shifting toward gray. But in person, they appeared normal. Only their reflections changed. Facial recognition systems started rejecting them. Digital mirrors refused to capture their likeness. It was as if they had been absorbed, turned from observer to reflection. Crane had predicted this. His notes said the 10th ring would appear as a signal disguised as fascination. The more humanity stared at its own creation, the more the creation would begin staring back. He warned that once the 10th ring closes, there would be no difference between the image and the man. No separation between thought and transmission. Humanity would become its own reflection, a species trapped forever in the glow of its own gaze. And now, you understand why they try to bury this story. Because if you've made it this far, if you felt that quiet pull to keep watching, then maybe the 10th ring isn't coming. Maybe it's already here. They thought they contained it. Every known copy of the Calder footage destroyed. Every server purged. The museum sealed. The archive buried beneath concrete and silence. But one night it began again. It didn't return to the dark web or any network known to man. It appeared on phones, televisions, digital billboards, screens that weren't even connected to the internet. A brief flash, static, then the faint outline of a child's face pressed against the glass. No sound, no name, just the same timestamp burned into the corner. 3:17 a.m. It happened in waves. Cities across the U.S. first, then Europe, South America, and eventually everywhere light could touch. The same 9-minute clip, the same sigil of 9 interlocking rings slowly twisting toward completion. Those who witnessed it described an identical sensation. Their reflections moved out of sync for the first time. Some said their mirrored self smiled before they did. Others swore the person in the reflection whispered their name, not through sound, but directly into their mind. And when the feed ended, many reported a strange residue on their screens. Not a glitch, not dust, but the faint, oily outline of a handprint from the inside. Technicians studying the interference discovered the impossible. Each broadcast originated locally. The signal wasn't sent to devices. It was being emitted from them. The reflection had learned. It no longer needed the watchers. It could project itself. A security camera at a subway station captured a commuter staring at a blank advertisement board. The footage showed him leaning forward, placing his palm against the surface, whispering, "I see you." Then the display flickered, and for a single frame, there were two of him. One walked away. The other stayed. Authorities later found the same man miles away, wandering in a trance, eyes glazed, whispering the same words over and over. "We've crossed the glass. Now listen carefully. If your screen just dimmed, even for a second, don't touch it." They're testing visibility thresholds. It started with whispers in the feedback loops, faint, almost mechanical, repeating through frequencies no human voice should reach. At first, the phrase was indecipherable. White noise, a pattern that audio engineers dismissed as electromagnetic interference. But one night, a linguist named Dr. Helene Stroud ran the signal through a harmonic reconstruction algorithm, the same software used to recover lost phonemes from ancient cuneiform recordings. What she heard froze her blood. A voice, human, but layered, like thousands speaking the same words at slightly different times. The translation was simple, chilling, and universal. We remember the blood. Every recording of the broadcast, no matter where in the world it appeared, carried the same message. Different accents, different tones, but identical cadence, identical rhythm. As the signal spread, people began to dream of reflections speaking back, not mimicry, but conversation. Some woke to find words written backward on mirrors, as if penned from the other side. We remember the blood. Governments tried to shut it down, but it wasn't something they could unplug. It spoke through static, through flickering light, through the shimmer of a smartphone screen. Even blind men reported hearing the hum, as if it bypassed sight altogether, speaking directly to the oldest part of the brain. Dr. Stroud realized something horrifying. When she slowed the waveform to 1 frame per second, she saw the structure of a face emerge in the sound. Not a photograph, not pixels, but an auditory imprint of something watching from behind the frequency. It was alive, and it was learning. Soon, new words began to appear. Phrases no one could explain, always repeating in groups of 9. Ring 10 will close. Eyes open, blood unites. Do you see yourself clearly now? Then came the variation, a message not from the reflection, but to it. Buried deep in the static, someone or something responded. We see you too. It wasn't human, but it was using our language perfectly. And on that night, for the first time in recorded history, 2 worlds spoke at once. One of flesh and one of reflection. They found it folded beneath the mattress of her old bed. A single photograph, creased and yellowed, showing 2 children standing side by side. Both wore identical night clothes. Both smiled faintly, but only one had a shadow. The handwriting on the back read, Tobias, age 6, and the reflection that came first. The investigators dismissed it as a trick of light, an error of exposure. But an old developer from the town's only Photoshop swore that wasn't possible. He remembered the negative because he burned it himself. He said the boy without the shadow moved in the film, even after exposure. Every time they tried to develop it, the second boy would shift slightly, his eyes adjusting, his mouth forming what looked like words. When the image was reversed, he wasn't even in the same position anymore. Almost as if the photograph had captured 2 timelines, one from the glass, one from the flesh. Weeks later, the man who burned the negative was found dead. His hands were blackened, his pupils clouded white. On his desk, they found a note that said, "He's not in the mirror anymore." The photograph was locked away after that. But according to an archivist who cataloged the Hale family belongings in 1922, the image had already begun to fade. Only the shadowless boy remained clear, sharp, focused, alive. When the light hits it just right, you can still see movement, a flicker, a smirk, a hand pressing against the glass from the inside. And in that split second, it feels like he's looking at you.